Hey, good evening, everybody. Good morning, good night, whatever it is. Um, Today, a little something different. Something I've noticed in our culture is that we have a tendency to idealize these past presidents or change, the significance of the president in some way or portray them in a different light than they may have been. I've seen that with Bush, for example, Bush baby, Junior, whatever the heck, baby Bush as I call him, the ex-governor of Texas. He's been now portrayed as being an artist, and this just great all-around guy. And of course, I'm not going to get into that, but that's just one example. And we've seen the same thing recently with Reagan. They made a film about him, which I have not seen. I'll admit that right off the bat. But I do know that Reagan, everybody goes, yeah, the conservative president is one of the best conservative, and everything was great. A bunch of lies. But I'm going to talk just specifically about a few things that are relevant in regards to things that have happened in the last, just last 3 or 4 years. For example, those of us who were concerned about the vaccines and blah, 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 and maybe people that questioned the vaccines, for example, wondered why pharmaceutical companies are completely exempt, really, from any sort of persecution. If they give you something that gives you a side effect or kills you or whatever, and it's happened, right? We know that smallpox, for example, back in the 70s under the other guy, what was his name? Ford. They had that thing going on. And there's just been all sorts of stuff where there's been problems with the vaccines. And we know also with the COVID ones in particular, there's obvious side effects going on for people that took them, two people that took them. And of course, that's brushed aside and other things are blamed, etc. But it goes back to Reagan. And that was the 1986 legislation that he did, National Childhood Vaccination Injury Act, which basically granted immunity to suing pharmaceutical companies. And that began with the DPT vaccine, which had been blamed for causing some sort of like an epilepsy. Some brain thing that happened to some people, and then they said there was no connection. And then, of course, the pharmaceutical company called it nonsense and things like that. And they weren't making the profits they needed because blah blah blah. And so what it did was is it established a federal no fault system to compensate victims of injury caused by mandated vaccines. So there's some things they put in, like the vaccine adverse event reporting system that was put into place, etc. But still, to this day, I mean, they cannot be. You can't just sue them. I mean, there are a few people here and there who've gotten money from side effects from vaccines, but overall, this legislation in particular was the legislation that basically gave them free run. It eliminated financial liability for vaccine manufacturers from vaccine injury claims. And of course that was done to keep a stable market. Really, it was done all for business. In the end, that was completely done for business, to make sure that these companies could keep producing their drugs at a lower cost because they don't have to worry about being sued. So in other words, safety went out the window, and your ability to sue these companies went out the window in order to ensure that these companies could keep making profit. And of course now, if you pay attention to what's happened with vaccines now, they give them like 72 doses and shit before the kids are 9 years old or whatever, So whatever, it's changed a lot. It used to be like 5 vaccines, and it went to like 12, and now it's like 19 or something, and then there's all these different doses and sequences that they have to follow. So of course this keeps the pharmaceutical companies quite happy. Quite happy. And they don't have to worry about the consequences of what they've done. If they made a mistake, if they didn't do the right testing, which a lot of these vaccines lately seem to have been rushed. I heard there's even a new one for monkeypox, for example. Really? So, I mean, that's one thing that Reagan did. He signed that into legislation. And that was in 1986. Okay? That was one of the joys that he brought to us. Okay? Vaccine manufacturers exempt from persecution. Who cares? Okay? Now, if you're a person who smokes pot or something, maybe you do drugs or something. Maybe you smoke pot, or whatever it is. Well, if you try to go get a job in a lot of workplaces, and everybody knows this is true, a lot of workplaces now require, guess what? Guess what? It requires what? It requires a drug test. Ronald Reagan signed that law into effect, uh, if I'm not mistaken, around '88, the end of his almost the end of his presidency, right? Uh, he signed that into law as an executive order, and that banned federal employees on or off duty from using drugs. Okay, so guess what? They had to establish a drug-free workplace, whatever the heck that means, and that spread, of course. That also was in the military. That spread to the military, of course, and then, of course, it spread into the private sector. So almost any job that you take, for example, let's say you're going to be running a forklift, or I don't know, working in a warehouse, whatever it is, working class jobs, per se. Okay, guess what? They almost all require drug tests now. Now, who did this work for? Who benefited from this? Well, whoever owned stock in drug testing companies that produced the drug tests. So that's another thing he gave us. So even in the workplace, there's his shadow, And I'm not going to go into anything about drugs per se, but I'm just going to simply say that I don't think it's anybody's business what somebody does in their own free time. But that's me. So, for example, you smoke a joint at a party on a Friday. Who cares? Why should that matter to anybody? And it shows up in your system 20 days later or whatever. What possible difference does that make? But we can chase all that back to money again, because then the insurance company will say, oh, well, they were high on marijuana. They had an accident. You can have an accident completely sober, too, of course, but that's another story. But so here's another thing he did. Now, I don't know if you were going to start getting into the constitutional aspects of this, but what he's done, from just what I've talked about with the vaccine manufacturers, he just granted a great grand freedom to these companies, right? And now he's created a new industry, and that is drug testing. I mean, there's drug tests now that they'll take your blood. They'll test for nicotine, for goodness sakes. You're not supposed to smoke a freaking cigarette, because insurance, So this is another thing that he, signed into law, Executive Order 12564, if you're interested. That was when it banned. I mean, imagine being able to tell somebody, you can't do this when you're not working for me, or when you're working for me. Wow. And of course, cannabis is probably the most common drug, and it stays in your system the longest. So that's the one that puts you at the most risk, and it's probably the most benign of any of the drugs that can be tested for. Oh, really? I'm worried about the potheads causing trouble. Not really. I might be worried about the cokeheads, but coke only stays in your system supposedly about 3 days. Same with like crystal meth. And there's some drugs that don't even show up, like psilocybin, mescaline, LSD. Those don't show up in your blood. So what are they primarily testing for? Cannabis. And again, this was Reagan. Now I know somebody's gonna say, yeah, but there was an accident with a train, and some people got hurt, and blah blah blah. So if you basically, the law applies to anybody who works in federal contracting, trucking, oil, gas. Okay, they have to have policies about that. Okay, and they're part of the employment contract. Okay. And even though cannabis is legal now in 26 states or something crazy, guess what? It's still punishable. Even though the state has said, it should be legal, it's still punishable if you smoke a joint on Friday night and go to work on Monday and they drug test you. Thanks, Reagan. Yeah, all right. He's conservative. I would say that constitutionally that violates right off the bat a couple of different things. Well, first of all, really the Fourth Amendment, your right to privacy. Right off the bat, without even trying. How's that constitutional? But anyway, so that's another thing Reagan did here. So that's two things. Okay. Now, there's been another bunch of controversies lately about asset forfeiture. Okay, that's another thing that's been coming. I've been hearing about that more or less off and on, and how it's terrible and stuff like that. Okay, well, you know what that came from, guys? That came from the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984. Signed into law by Ronald Reagan on October 12th, 1984. Okay? All right? So, this guy, when he passed this, and he was a drug warrior. I grew up, in the 80s, 70s and 80s, because I was born in 69. So, I grew up during the time of Just Say No, Nancy Reagan, and what was that? Dare, and, all that. I remember when they attempted assassination on him, and at that time, the country, I think, cared about presidents, and they sent us home from school early. And I was a little upset, though, because they kept showing this footage of him being shot over and over again. I couldn't watch any of my after-school shows, like The Brady Bunch, He-Man, or whatever it was I was watching at the time. I was in 6th grade when that happened. But anyway, I went off the topic a little bit. But yeah, this is another thing that he brought us. This is another thing that he brought us. Okay, so he gave us asset forfeiture. Isn't that nice? And of course, he increased penalties for cultivation, possession, and transferring marijuana. That's another thing. So again, cannabis, you know, and civil forfeiture, asset forfeiture may have been just originally, let's say it was for organized crime. That's always the excuse. But of course, everybody knows now that that affects everybody. I'm sure you've read the horror stories. Somebody traveling with a large amount of cash, no drugs on them, but they got a large amount of cash. They have to prove the cash gets confiscated. They have to prove where the cash came from. If they don't have any proof, let's say it's your life savings, you just had in a box. You've been collecting $100 a month and putting it away or whatever for 10 years. You have to prove where it came from. If you can't prove where it came from, they keep it. And like I remember, seeing those dare vehicles, and I always thought to myself, how disgusting. They robbed somebody through a legal method, and then they steal their car and paint it with some drug crap, propaganda. This drug war stuff is amazing. And again, if you lived through the 80s, you remember this. Just say no. This is your brain on drugs. This was the time of, like, what was that? That parents, the lady, Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, I think he was a senator at the time. And if you remember that crazy shit, that gives you an idea of the whole mentality of the country at the time. This is just this grossness, this, I mean, I would consider myself to be conservative by today's standards, but I would have probably been considered a liberal in 1988. It's funny because the bars had moved over and stuff. So, what was liberal 20 years ago is now a conservative, and what's liberal now is basically a communist. They're way over to the left, way past any point that I could even conceivably imagine. And yet, one thing I've noticed in this country in the last couple of years is there's no more anti-war crowd except for the Palestinian thing. But there's a war going on in Ukraine. We've got troops in Syria. We've got troops in We've got troops in near Iran. We've got troops near Israel. We've got the whole U.S. Navy, 1/3 of it sitting off the coast of out in the Red Sea or whatever. And then the other night on the debate, Kamal was like, "We don't have any troops in harm's way." I just read about some troops that got hit in Iraq. And this woman lies to us blatantly. And I'm thinking, well, isn't 1/3 of the Navy basically sitting by Yemen? And the Houthis are like shooting rockets at them and stuff. Isn't that a war zone at this point? But she says we're not in a war zone. I'm just flabbergasted. And yeah, there was no fact checking on her. I don't mean to go off on a topic or on a tangent, but just another aspect of the whole thing. The insanity of our culture right now. And the fact that people try to glamorize or idealize Ronald Reagan. Are you kidding me? What's there to idealize about this guy? So we have the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of '84. Okay, and again, so this opened up all sorts of more drug war stuff, and this went into effect on October 12th, 1984. Signed into law on October 12th, 1984 by Ronald Reagan. This guy was busy signing crap left and right, and all of it did was, most of it at least, or I'd say all of it, was increase government power. Power into your private life. Okay, the corporation, big pharma are allowed to do whatever it wants without having to be in any risk of financial liability. I mean, it's just great. Wow, that's really great. So we got asset forfeiture, we got drug testing or piss testing, we got pharmaceutical companies exempt from persecution or financial liability. Well, what else did he do? Now, if you're a gun person, and I do like guns, and I do have some videos on firearms and that kind of thing. One thing that I think, and I might sound extreme, but I'm a complete advocate of the Second Amendment. And one thing that really disappoints me is that for me to buy a machine gun, and I would be completely eligible to do so, as far as my background and all that, I can't afford it. You can't afford them. You know why you can't afford a machine gun? I don't know if you guys know why you can't afford a machine, but I'm going to tell you why you can't afford a machine gun. Okay? Because, once again, in 1986, Ronald Reagan passed legislation called the Firearms Owners Protection Act, which is disguised, or I've read people say, oh yeah, it's a rollback of gun control. Yes, that's true. But it also ended the private manufacture of machine guns. Okay? You could not own machine guns after '86, after this was passed into law. Okay? You couldn't own machine guns. After May 19th, 1986, you could own them, but you can no longer manufacture manufacture them. Okay? All right? So you can't make any new ones. So basically what's happened with machine guns, if you're interested in this, okay, the prices are astronomically high. Let's say you wanted an MP40, like the dummy gun that I have, a real one though. Go on Gunbroker. They're $20,000, $18,000, $23,000, $26,000, $15,000, $12,000, and the reason, and all machine guns are like that. Anything you can pick, they're going to be in the thousands and thousands of dollars. And the reason why is because whatever's on the market is all that's on the market, unless you're in law enforcement or something like that. But as far as private civilian, ownership, citizen ownership, no new machine guns can be manufactured. Okay, so because of that, those machine guns are very valuable. So what does that mean? That means that the only people that really can own a machine gun are wealthy people. Now I know some people are like, "Oh, machine guns are evil and shit." I mean, but I mean, it's a piece of history. I know if I had a machine gun, I wouldn't be out shooting anybody with it. I just like the things because they're neat. That's it. I'm not gonna go kill anybody. No, most normal people don't do that. That's the thing that people in gun control, that are, all gun control people forget, is that normal people, I'm gonna kill someone. I mean, something's wrong with those people. But anyway, so this is another thing that Reagan did. Okay, Firearm Owners Protection Act. Notice how it's phrased, so it sounds really great. Firearms protection, we're going to protect them. Okay, so again, it banned the sale, just to make it quick, it banned the sale to civilians of machine guns manufactured after the date of enactment, restricting those sales to only the military and law enforcement. Everybody's favorite friends, everybody's buddies, right? The military and law enforcement. We can trust them, but we can't trust regular civilians. So, because of that, most machine guns, okay, are over, they're going to be anywhere $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, okay? And there's still about 175,000 of them left. And as far as everybody knows, as far as the ATF has said, there's never been a single crime committed with one of those legally owned, fully automatic machine guns. Think of the irony of that. But again, who's going to be able to own them? Only people who are able to deal with the federal bureaucracy, deal with the Class 3 license thing, your background check, where do you store it, they can inspect, blah, 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 all sorts of stuff, all sorts of regulations, the tax, and then the price has been inflated because of this basically forced restriction on the manufacturing of these weapons. Thanks, Reagan! Thanks! And so what does that violate constitutionally? Well, I would say personally, again, that violates the Second Amendment. Asset forfeiture, I don't even know where to start with that one. What does that violate? Like every law, any civility in this society right there, that's just a violation of everything. I'm stealing your money because you can't prove where you got it from. And really, the government's just as corrupt as the most corrupt people there are. So, like they're any better than anybody else, right? Who are they to judge in that sense? But anyway, so when anybody says to you, "Oh yeah, Reagan is a great bastion of conservatism," well, as far as I'm concerned too, you have to remember something else. I think I mentioned it briefly earlier. We also had the formation in '85 of the Parents Music Resource Center, the PMRC, if you remember that. And that again was Tipper Gore's wife. Tipper Gore was the wife of Senator Al Gore, and those were the people who ended up taking songs like "My House," or "We're Not Gonna Take It" by Twisted Sister. Some Motley Crue stuff I think was on the list that they had. These songs were evil. Got to put a sticker. That's where those stickers everybody sees those. Say parental advice. What is it? I probably have albums with that crap on them. You don't see it as much as you used to, but for a while, every album that was like had any, it would have like a little warning on it. Parental guidance suggested or whatever. So again, this is another example of what was going on in the '80s. So what would that be a violation of? Well, it'd be a violation of maybe First Amendment. I don't know, freedom of speech. Sing whatever you want. Even Cyndi Lauper had a song that was on their list of bad songs. So this was all that happened under Reagan as well. But the four things that I just kind of covered, in my opinion, are probably the things that have the most impact on our daily lives, so to speak. The drug pissing in a bottle. Really? What kind of society thinks that urine belongs? And that's what pisses me off too. These people go, "My body, my choice." Where were those people at during the drug war? There was nobody saying, "My body, my choice." Where were they? So I don't have any. I'm not real sympathetic to that whole philosophy, because that philosophy only seems to be when it's convenient for a particular group. But when it would be convenient for the entire society at large, that doesn't exist. Notice the vaccines as well. My body, my choice didn't fly during that. It only seems to fly if it involves, you know, the abortion thing. Other than that, your body belongs to the government. At least that's how these people act. So, again, if somebody tells you, "Oh, Reagan was great, man. He's a great president," well, you can tell them, well, maybe if you don't like machine guns, and maybe if you like the pharmaceutical companies don't have to be worried about hurting you, and maybe if you like pissing in a bottle in front of somebody to get a stupid job, if you like those things, maybe it was great. Maybe if you like having your money stolen by the government or your property, well, then Reagan was a great president. He did a lot for the American people. And you know why he did it? Because he loves us. And the whole motivation for, I'm sure, every one of these things in the end was simply money. Now, of course, the parents thing, that obviously has nothing to do with this. That wasn't even him. That's just a reflection of the type of attitude and mentality that was very prevalent in the 80s. The 80s were a very interesting time to be alive, those of you who have lived through it or whatever. And anyway, so that is my dispelling the myth of Ronald Reagan. And there's more. I don't want to go into Iran-Contra. I don't want to go into Grenada. I don't want to go into any of those things. I was talking more just about things that affect us here on a very direct level, even though we might not think it does. Maybe you don't care about machine guns. But there are people who do and would like to own one and can't afford them because this person did that. Maybe there are people who'd like to sue a vaccine manufacturer, but guess what? You're not doing that. Maybe you don't like having your stuff stolen by the government. Okay? Maybe you don't believe in that companies should be exempt, whatever. That's what his legacy is. And if you know anything about government, once the government gets a power, they don't give it up. If they can, they'll expand it. And you guys know that. Everybody here, if anybody cares about my video at all, you are probably aware that that's one of the main purposes of government, is its own expansion. It never shrinks. That's why you've seen the Patriot Act renewed every single time that it comes back up for voting. If the party can always, if the two Republican and Democrats can always agree on one thing, it's always continual, subjection of their citizens to spying, etc. And so, don't ever forget that. Anyway, that's my little video on Ronald Reagan. Have a great day, night, morning, whatever it is. All right, Alvarado out.